Hi and welcome to Inquiry with Mirage. This is going to be a quick one-take video where I debunk one of the very dumb arguments that I've seen being used in trying to understand this drama that has occurred as a result of the United States of America leaving Afghanistan in the haphazard way in which they did. The argument, which I think is incredibly stupid, goes something like this. The United States of America does not have a moral responsibility to help the specific individuals which are going to suffer under the Taliban. And the reason for why they don't have a moral responsibility to help those specific people is because those specific people would have suffered regardless of whether or not the US had withdrawn or been in Afghanistan and then withdrawn in the first place. Because if the US had not been involved in Afghanistan and not withdrawn in the way in which they did, the Taliban would have controlled Afghanistan regardless, and hence the people would have suffered regardless. Hence, the United States of America's government, in conclusion, doesn't have any unique moral responsibility to help these people. Now, so I assume that many of you have seen this argument being used in trying to analyze the situation. This argument is very silly and is very wrong on multiple levels of analysis. On the first level of analysis in which it's wrong is just the fact that there's a very intuitive argument to be made that given the fact that the US is a large power who has the capacity and opportunity to help and are the best situated in the world to help these particular people who will suffer under the Taliban via, for example, the United States government's means to help rescue those people, help set up refugee camps, etc. And given the fact that these people are innocent human beings, innocent human moral patients who deserve not to be tortured and killed and raped, the US government therefore has a duty and a moral responsibility to help those people. So that's just like a kind of counter argument you can quickly make that I think hold significantly more weight than the argument previously presented as to why the US doesn't have any moral responsibility. But now setting that aside and going into the two particulars as to why this argument that the US doesn't have any moral responsibility is specifically dumb, the first reason is that it makes a faulty comparison of between two different worlds actually. So, because the world in which the United States government invades Afghanistan, wages a 20-year war and then withdraws in this haphazard ways, and as a result of that, certain people will suffer under the Taliban regime, is not identical to the world in which the United States government never invades Afghanistan, and hence the Taliban is always in control, and hence people are always suffering under the Taliban regime. It is specifically different in this important way for evaluating the argument at hand. The people who are now will come to suffer due to the US invasion, control, and subsequent withdrawal from the Afghanistan and the reinstating of the control of the Taliban regime are not the same people that would have existed in the world in which the US government never invaded Afghanistan in the first place, and the Taliban hence was always in control. So to make this simple, in world A, the US is the world, it's our world, and in world B is the world in which the US never invaded. Now the people who are suffering at this point in time in world A are not the same people who would suffer in world B. So therefore, the argument does not pan out, because the argument is claiming that the people would have suffered regardless of whether the US invaded or not, and hence that is the reason why the US doesn't have any unique moral responsibility to these people. But the people are not the same in either case, because when US invaded Afghanistan, when they invaded Afghanistan and when they waged the 20-year world, that gave rise to a new set of people that wouldn't have existed in the world in which they did not invade and the Taliban was always in control, right? This is trivially true because if you have sex or if the conception happens just a few minutes or moments after it in fact happened than it would have been another baby being born. So fine-grained is the determination of sperm and the interaction with the egg. And of course we're talking about way more of a robust differentiation between world A and world B, right? Okay, so that is one way in which the argument is severely flawed. But I think perhaps the more important way in which the argument is severely flawed is that it just posits a wrong picture of how we go about determining moral responsibility. It specifically makes use of a faulty way of operating with counterfactual analysis. And we can see this just by having a simple and quick thought experiment. So let's say you have two assassins. You have assassin A and assassin B, and they're meant to assassinate target X. Assassin A and assassin B are not working together, so they have independent missions to assassinate target X. Now, assassin A arrives there first, just moments before assassin B. So assassin A is the one who ends up assassinating target X. Now, obviously, assassin A can't claim or defect from moral responsibility from the wrongdoing of having murdered and assassinated target X by pointing to the fact that, well, if I didn't do this, assassin B would have done this, so person X would have suffered regardless. That just trivially doesn't seem to be an intelligible way of making sense of moral responsibility, nor does that seem to trivially be the way in which a person can deflect from their actions, the badness of their action and the wrongness of their actions, right? But if we want to be a bit more analytical about why it is not the case that you can use and assign moral responsibility in the way in which it is being done in the original argument, where people claim that the US has no moral responsibility because the people would have suffered regardless. This is the way to be more analytical about it. So what matters for moral responsibility for something bad is whether or not the bad occurrence is explained, in this case partially, by an other agent failing to falling below what we can properly demand of them, i.e. what morality demands of them. So applying this seemingly valid and widely accepted principle of determining moral responsibility to the specific case at hand, it is clear that the US is morally responsible, right? Because part of the explanation as to why these people who will now suffer under the Taliban regime in the way in which they will suffer is an explanation that can only be explained by making reference to the US behavior, i.e. these people will suffer, and they will suffer in the way in which they will suffer, partially because of the fact that the US didn't start evacuating earlier. They didn't set up refugee camps, and they didn't clearly communicate the truth with the Afghanistani government or the outside world, so the outside world could have had time to help and respond. Then the question is can we properly demand of the US, does morality demand of the US, that they should have started evacuating earlier, that they should have set up refugee camps in preparation for the fall of Kabul and Afghanistan generally, and that they should have communicated honestly and clearly with the Afghanistani government and with the world at large, so they could have been more prepared for what the consequences could come to be, and hence could have offered a helping hand. Well, obviously it's the case that the US should have done all of this, given that if they weren't to do all of this, then the consequences would be hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions people suffering in immense way. Hence, it seems quite clear in this case that the explanation for why the Afghanistani people who are now trapped under the Taliban regime will suffer, and for why they will suffer in the way in which they will suffer, is an explanation that has to do partially with the United States of America's government's behavior, and that their behavior is falling below what morality demands of them, is falling below what we can rightly normatively demand of their behavior. And hence, it trivially then seems to be the case that the United States of America's government has a moral responsibility to help the Afghanistani people. Yeah, that was it for this video. The argument was really dumb, so I don't want to say anything more. I hope you understand why it's dumb. If you don't understand why it's dumb, feel free to either leave a comment or to interact with me on Twitter.